Today, we take our medical understandings for granted, even going as far as to believe that we know better than scientists in their specific fields. It was surprisingly recent in our species' history that we finally began to understand the logistics behind disease and health. Before then, we did what we could to survive, but much of what these illnesses were widely considered to be a mystery, seeping its way through families, homes, and entire populations with no clear logic, leaving nothing but fear to fill in the gaps that science could not yet reach. When your understanding of the world is so heavily based around spirituality, mystery, and folklore, it's easy to see how you could begin to see patterns in things that are not really there. In the 1800s, tuberculosis was known by most as consumption, a slow, wasting disease that seemed to drain the body from the inside out. This was at a time before germ theory, and so many struggled to explain why multiple relatives could develop the same symptoms in sequence. It may seem obvious to us now, although without the prior understanding of just how these diseases spread, the people were left to fill the gaps with their own beliefs. And that is exactly what happened in several parts of New England. Here, that uncertainty collided with older European folklore about the restless dead, leading to strange and unusual acts shaped by grief, performing ritualistic remedies in order to create the illusion of control. My name is Luke Mordew, and this urban legend is Mercy Brown. As we know now, if you're at home with an easily spread illness and those around you remain in your vicinity, there's a high chance they're going to get sick with you. Back in the 19th century and before, however, that spread making its way to victims one by one was often perceived as a slow, deliberately cruel entity out to destroy a family. To many, it didn't feel random at all. How could it be? Instead, it felt targeted, as though something had chosen them. And long before caped undead creatures in high castles graced our screens, the word vampire was used in a far more practical sense, being a label for many things at the time. A dead body is a strange thing, especially to those who lack understanding of them. In fact, most of us know so little about the effects of death on a corpse that many of the misunderstandings of the time continue to this day. When a person would check on a particular corpse to check if they were perhaps a vampire hiding amongst the dirt, what they would find would not always be what you'd expect a cadaver to be. Skin can bloat, and sometimes dark fluids can seep from the mouth, with both images suggesting that the undead had been feeding. Their gums begin to retreat and pull back, revealing more of their teeth, making them look longer than they were in life. Even hair and nails can appear to have grown, which is still a belief that many share today. However, it is not that they have grown at all, and is instead from the skin shrinking and drying out. And with all this in mind, it becomes that little bit easier to understand how this confusion began to spread so fast. And at these signs, many across Europe have been documented to have committed specific acts in an attempt to stop the supposed feeding once and for all, which sometimes requires simple measures, such as repositioning of the body. Sometimes, however, it went much further than that, with some known to staking or even decapitating the bodies, whilst others preferred to burn them in a desperate attempt to save the living from their vampiric grip. In this chapter, I will not be telling a story of my imagination, and instead, I will be telling the true story of what happened to the Brown family during the dark days of the 1890s. The winter had been sitting on Exeter for so long now that the people in the town had begun to speak of it as if it was an omnipresent, oppressive force, sucking the life out of all they had. It would press itself into the cracks of doors and maneuver its way through the seams of their coats, making every room feel smaller and darker as the failing sun set each evening. But underneath it all, threaded through the town like a morbid melody, there was also the consistent sound of coughing. It felt as though it had happened so fast, with the mysterious illness feverishly burning through the town in what seemed to be a single night, and it had seemingly seeped into the lungs of unsuspecting victims with a slow and steady pace. With each passing day, they would lose more of their life, as if they were being drained by some unknown force, until eventually there would be nothing left to take, and the victims would finally draw their last breaths. The people of the town did all they could to survive, opening windows for as long as they could take in the bitterness of winter, mixing strange remedies in the hopes of easing the pain, praying to God that they were given the strength to beat it away. But in truth, many understood already that this was not something that could be bargained with. And once it had you, the chances of you wiggling out of its sinister grip were slim at best. For the Brown family, who lived amongst it all and had witnessed far too much, the sorrow had begun to take its toll on the survivors. First, George Brown had watched his wife succumb to the illness before scrambling to help his daughter Mary Olive as much as he could before her inevitable passing the following year. The walls of their home were now filled with the horrors of death, stained with the stench of loss and grief. They worked hard to keep things going, ensuring that the household kept running as things always should, but before long, it had become clear to all that George's son, Edwin, was now also falling ill. Eddie, as he was known by his friends and family, was already married and working hard as he should have been. Although these working days had grown more and more difficult as time seemed to carve away at his face bit by bit, as the disease that had already taken his mother and sister spread through his veins. He had gone away for some time, chasing warmer climates in an attempt to ease his lungs, and at one point it was even believed that this was very much the case. Although, when he returned once again, it was clear to all who had hoped for a happy ending that they were going to be left with disappointment. He was as weak and tired as before, now back exactly where he was before he left. Unfortunately, though, the family's bad fortune was only about to get worse, as now, his younger sister, 19-year-old Mercy Brown, had also grown ill. Although, unlike Eddie, she was not able to fight off the strange ailments as thoroughly as he had, and soon after, she was also dead. This was a horrifying event amongst the town, not only due to the fact that Edwin was now the last remaining of the Brown children, but also because she was so young on her deathbed. At this point, Edwin could only wait to die, growing significantly worse as time went on, now coughing up blood and wasting away in his bed, propped up by pillows, too weak to sit up unassisted. He was comforted with cloths and broths supplied by his remaining family and neighbours. Friends would occasionally come to engage in conversations, and even the minister would make his visits in the hopes of being some help. Although they could all see that each time they saw him, his skin had grown paler and thinner, as if stretched over too much bone. It was then, however, that a strange notion began to make its way through the many whispers in town, as some ideas of what was truly going on began to be taken more seriously than previously thought. The Browns' neighbors were more than aware of what was happening within the household, and it had not gone unnoticed at just how unlucky the family had seemed to be, with each member decaying one by one. It almost felt as though they were cursed with misfortune, as if they were being actively targeted by something that could not yet be explained. This opened the doors to the strange and unnerving theory that someone out there was perhaps doing it to them. In fact, some had even begun to wonder if this curse could even continue after death. Medicine was failing the townsfolk of Exeter at this point, and they were growing desperate, trying to make sense of a disease that they did not yet fully understand. All physical remedies they had attempted were consistently failing, suggesting that this ailment was beyond our realm entirely. This may not have been a disease draining the people of their lives after all. Perhaps it was something else entirely. Perhaps it was a vampire. With this in mind, a plan was put in place by some to exhume the bodies of those afflicted by the illness. And here, or so they believed, they would be able to examine the corpses, where they would find signs of a vampiric nature if their suspicions were ever to be found true. And this caused quite a stir amongst the locals, of course, with many suggesting that this was a ridiculous concept. Although the blending of fear and superstition had now taken hold amongst some, and before long, the pressure had reached the door of George Brown himself, who was still desperate to help his ailing son before it was too late. By now, he had lost almost everyone he loved, and he would do anything to ensure his son's survival. And so, on the 17th of March, 1892, George granted permission to have the bodies exhumed and examined as a last resort. And with that, a group made up of George, a local journalist, and a Dr. Metcalf made their way to the cemetery. Dr. Metcalf was there as an official for the events, although this was with great reluctance, as he sat very much within the camp of those who felt this whole charade was ridiculous. But even so, in the cold of the night, the men began to dig. By now, the spring air was teasing its arrival, and the ground was already softer than it had been, allowing them to get through with ease. First, they dug up the older of the graves, gently prying open the coffin of Mary Eliza. Cautiously, the men approached, with George's heart breaking all over again as he looked down at what was once his beloved wife, already mostly bone. This was a harrowing but ultimately reassuring sight for believers, as the men ruled out Mary Eliza as the potential vampire. Next, they turned their attention to Mary Olive's coffin, George's daughter who had passed away nearly a decade prior. She was no longer recognizable to her father, although this did not soften the blow any further as he looked down upon the heavily decayed remains of what was once his family. Luckily though, once again, there were no signs of vampiric nature. After this, the men turned their attention to the third and final coffin of the Brown family. That of Mercy Brown, who had died only a couple of months prior. This was going to be harder to bear, as her decay would be significant and yet fresh, still being very recognizable to her grieving father. With that in mind, they opened her coffin with hesitation, ready to look down upon the gruesome sight of a freshly decaying corpse. However, they were shocked to find that she almost looked as if she was just sleeping. She was undoubtedly dead, that was for sure, although the level of decay was significantly less so than what they'd expected from somebody who had been dead for months. In fact, some witnesses even claimed that she looked completely untouched, as if she had crawled into her grave that very morning. And this, of course, set alarm bells off in the minds of these vampire hunters, and so, with haste, they began to conduct their grim examination. First, they opened Mercy's chest to inspect her heart, and found an unusual sight that only solidified their horrified concerns. The heart itself was not beating, nor was it warm. However, it was still filled with clotted, decomposing blood, far too fresh for the body's age. This confused and horrified those attending even further, as the evidence that Mercy Brown was both dead and alive began to pile up. This was enough to confirm the guilty plea that Mercy Brown was, in fact, a vampire, and even in death, was feeding on Edwin's life force from the grave. And with this realization, the men leapt into action. First, they removed Mercy's heart and liver, placing them both upon a nearby fire, burning them to a crisp until there were nothing but ash upon it. This, they believed, was the first step of a ritual that would finally cut the connection between Edwin and his undead attacker. The men then scooped up these ashes, mixing them with water to create an elixir of sorts, before dashing straight back to the Browns' home, where Edwin waited in pain. When the men arrived, they were greeted by an ailing Edwin, who was still alive, but growing weaker by the hour, bedridden and drained. They did not discuss deeply, with Edwin himself keen for the horrors to subside. Instead, George handed his son the tonic to drink. And he did, with all hoping that it would finally break the curse, once and for all. From there, all they could do was wait, hoping that by finally destroying the local vampire, they could be free of its wretched curse that haunted them for so many years. They had put the bodies back into the ground to rest. The air had grown significantly warmer as spring came around, and the skies had become consistently brighter once more. Regardless of this, however, as time went on, Edwin only seemed to continue spiraling into illness and died only 2 months after the ritual. With this in mind, the locals of the town had 2 possible outcomes they needed to accept. Either they had gotten it wrong, and the illness was simply an ailment that they were not yet equipped to deal with, or they had gotten it right, but were simply too late. Perhaps Edwin was already just far too weak to continue, after being drained for so long from the vampire that was once known as Mercy Brown. The English word vampire first entered print in the early 1730s, surfacing in Western European reports about supposed vampire incidents in Eastern Europe. And it was those reports that helped popularize the idea of them in the English-speaking world. This includes clusters of deaths, suspicion of the first dead, exhumation, and the ritualistic solution that occurred on that fateful night. The incident of Mercy Brown now exists as a significantly dark and strange moment in human history, although it is worth noting that this was not by any means an isolated event. These ideas were instead part of a far broader regional phenomenon now commonly referred to as the New England Vampire Panic. This occurred during the 18th and 19th centuries, spreading through communities across Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Vermont. These were locations where significant waves of consumption deaths have been documented, an illness that contemporary medicine was only just beginning to finally understand, especially in the more rural areas where germ theory had yet to display older explanations for why illnesses seemed to move through households in sequence. Now, it is also worth noting that the term New England Vampire Panic is a modern label placed upon these events. And you may actually be surprised to know that researchers of these cases have repeatedly pointed out that the word vampire was actually largely an outsider's word, used instead by newspapers and later retellings. In fact, families living with the disease often described it as the dead consuming the living. In that sense, it wasn't said to be a vampire literally, especially not what we think of today. And instead, it was seen more of an unseen influence that lingers amongst the living, draining the sick from the grave. This consumption is what we know today as tuberculosis, a disease that was widely feared for many years due to the devastating way it drained its victims, causing wasting, coughing, fever, and the characteristic bloody sputum. It was due to the mysterious nature of tuberculosis transmission, combined with its tendency to affect multiple members of the same household, that desperate communities began to seek explanations that could make emotional and practical sense of what they were seeing. As often happened in human history, a lack of scientific understanding left people with what they had: religion, superstition, and folk tradition. From this, suspicions began to spread that whoever had first died due to this horrifying disease was now somehow feeding off the rest of the family from the grave. And it was thought that this was why the living would go on to show similar symptoms, sometimes even dying themselves. Now, of course, people also began to come up with ways to fight back, using ritual practices to identify and neutralize whoever they believed was responsible. And in some New England communities, families exhumed relatives' bodies, following folk traditions meant to detect and stop the supposed source. And it would be here, amongst the dread and stench, that some would believe that they found proof of this fact. They would see that hair and fingernails appeared to have continued to grow. They at times even found bodies that seemed less decayed than expected, particularly in colder conditions. Some accounts even described organs that still contained liquid blood or blood-darkened tissue, just like what was described with Mercy. However, with modern science, we now understand that this can occur naturally depending on timings and the temperature of the area the body is kept. Without this knowledge, though, these findings only confirmed their beliefs, and the various methods would be put in place to stop the harm they were causing the living. Some accounts describe repositioning the body, sometimes face down. Others describe more extreme measures, going as far as decapitation or the removal and burning of the heart or other organs. In some cases, the ashes were mixed with liquid and given to the sick as a tonic, a grotesque act that sat somewhere between folk medicine and sheer panic. This all being said though, it is worth noting that this was not limited to one decade and expanded far beyond this town. In fact, years before Mercy was even born, there were other cases that followed the very same pattern of reasoning and ritual, such as the 1817 South Woodstock, Vermont case. This involved a man named Frederick Ransom, whose family testimony described the removal of his heart to be burned in a blacksmith's forge in the belief that it would protect the surviving relatives. Even Henry David Thoreau, the American writer and naturalist best known for Walden and his essay Civil Disobedience, wrote in his journal in September 1859, reacting to a similar report out of Vermont. He called it evidence that the savage in man is never quite eradicated, describing a family who had burned the organs of the last deceased to prevent further deaths. The Mercy Brown case, however, stands out above the others, mostly due just to how recent it occurred, in 1892. Interestingly, at this point in time, medical science had already begun to advance at rapid speeds, and acts such as rituals were already considered fairly archaic, even by that time standard. However, it also stands out due to the journalist that was there to witness it all, meaning that it was covered in great detail, reported and repeated several times, becoming one of the best known examples of those practices taking place. With that in mind, it's worth pointing out the obvious. Mercy Brown is not an urban legend, and what happened to her is very much within the realm of our real-world history. Instead, the legend is within the belief at the time, in a way that shows itself amongst urban legends even today. The tragic story of the Browns family began in the early 1800s, in December 1883. Mary Eliza Brown, Mercy's mother, died of tuberculosis, and not long after this, her daughter Mary Olive also died in 1884, aged around 20. It wasn't until a few years later that George Brown's son, Edwin, known locally as Eddie, contracted the disease in 1891. Interestingly, Edwin, who was described as a strong and healthy young man before his illness, had actually made his way to Colorado Springs in search of treatment, hoping that the warmer air and sun would help his ailments. Now, this is noteworthy, as this act shows that they did have an understanding of their current medicine, with climate therapy being a widely used practice in the 19th century. The idea here was that being in drier, warmer places, often sanitariums, would be good for them, with clear air, warmth, and better altitude. Although whether this helped Edwin or not on a short-term basis, he returned to Rhode Island in 1892, still sick. Only now, finding out that Mercy was also in the grips of the same illness. By this point, she had been ill for some time, and in January 1892, Mercy Lena Brown died, aged 19. And some retellings in my research have cited a short obituary line along the lines of Miss Mercy Lena Brown, who has been suffering from consumption, died Sunday morning. Although, whether that exact phrasing is quoted correctly or not is hard to confirm. That said, the way these obituaries were written at the time were known for being blunt and to the point, far from what we have today. At this point, George Brown had lost his wife and 2 daughters already, and had now had to watch as his son continued to waste away, which is then why the vampire elements appeared. Some later summaries claim the Browns were the only family in the area affected, but that's difficult to verify in any real sense, and it seems unlikely to be anything more than a narrative addition on what was to come. What we are able to confirm, however, was that neighbours in the area had begun to fear the spreading of this illness and had convinced themselves that the Brown household had become the centre of something unnatural and sinister. Curiously, and an aspect I left out of the story in order not to repeat myself, George Brown himself was actually often described as reluctant. In fact, accounts suggest that he wasn't a believer in vampire folklore, at least in that sense, but the pressure from those around him became too much for him to ignore. Whether he agreed out of desperation, exhaustion, or simply the need to calm a panicking community, he gave permission for the exhumation of his deceased family members. Some sources out there report that he refused to be present when it happened, though, which does actually fit the psychological reality of the situation, although that is also an element that is difficult to confirm. It was March 17th, 1892, that a group gathered at the cemetery behind the Baptist Church in Exeter, referred to historically as Shrub Hill Cemetery, although today it's known as Chestnut Hill Cemetery. The group included local men and a family doctor, Harold Doc Metcalf, who had treated Mercy during her illness. This is another element that is often confused in retellings, as some suggest that Dr. Metcalf arrived with the men, whereas others suggest that he actually found them at work and approached. And next follows what we've heard before. First, they exhumed the bodies of Mary Eliza and Mary Olive. Both had been in the ground for years, and what they found matched what they expected. Decomposition, remnants of mummified tissue, and nothing that looked to them like continued life. But then they turned their attention to Mercy, who compared to the others appeared remarkably preserved. Accounts describe her looking far less decayed than expected, and some report liquid blood still present in her heart. Various retellings also mention that her hair and nails appeared to have grown and that her body seemed positioned differently, as if she had somehow moved whilst supposedly dead. This is where the reality differs from the story, however, as Dr. Metcalf is often described as trying to explain at least some of these signs as natural, although the explanations didn't matter in a group that had already arrived, hoping to find a culprit. And with that, Mercy Brown was quickly declared the source of Edwin's continued demise. From here, the men did what folk tradition told them had to be done, removing Mercy's heart and burning it on a nearby rock. Some sources claim that another organ may have also been burnt, although this again was hard to confirm. Some accounts say it was her liver that they burnt alongside the heart, whereas others claim it was in fact her lungs. In this sense, the true story has changed over time, morphing depending on who the storyteller is, just like that of urban legends today. Whatever the organs were, the ashes of them were then mixed with liquid, usually described as water, to create what is commonly referred to as a tonic, and that drink was given to the ailing Edwin in the hope it would break Mercy's hold over him and reverse the symptoms. But of course it didn't, and Edwin died later that spring, with it looking like it was likely 2nd of May, 1892. He was 24 years old. The story of Mercy Brown had given the town a slight dash of hope, only for it to be instantly stripped away, leaving some with shame, others with embarrassment, and many with frustration and fear. What they had partaken in was a strange and unnerving event, fed by nothing but an idea and a story that would continue for years to come. If you're still listening, you likely share the same fascination with strange stories and unexplained legends that I do. For just £3 a month on Patreon, you'll unlock Modern Myths, an exclusive bonus series released in the week between our chapters, ensuring that you get an episode a week. You'll also get behind-the-scenes insights, discounts on merch, and access to our private community chat where you can connect with me and other folklore fans. I even name characters in my stories after patrons at random, so your name could become part of the retellings themselves. Your support fuels the research and the production and ensures our understanding of these legends continue to grow. Click the Patreon link in the show notes to join us, and together, we'll keep folklore alive. But for now, back to the legend. When we break down the strange preserved state that the townsfolk found Mercy's body in, there are plausible explanations rooted in timing and conditions. Mercy died in January in Rhode Island, a notably cold time. In fact, multiple accounts have reported that her body would have likely been kept in a cold above-ground space, sometimes described as a receiving tomb or vault, because the ground would have likely been too frozen for burial until the earth thawed in the later months. So with that in mind, we have to then acknowledge that we now know that cold air significantly slows decomposition and can also preserve the appearance of blood and delay post-mortem changes that people expect to see. Fascinatingly, by the time of Mercy Brown's death in 1892, medical science had already made real progress in the understanding of tuberculosis. It was Robert Koch who identified the tuberculosis bacterium in 1882, 10 years before Mercy's death. That being said, identifying something in the laboratory and having that knowledge reshape folk belief in rural communities are two very different timelines, especially in a time where news travels far slower than today. There would have been areas in the Americas during that time that would find this act barbaric and ridiculous, which is proven by the fact it was noteworthy at all. But empathy is required as we acknowledge that people believe in things even today that others would deem ludicrous. And with that, it is worth noting that researchers who have spent years tracing these cases have argued that the people at the center of the epidemic did not typically use the word vampire about themselves or their dead. And in fact, in many instances, that term appears to have been driven by press coverage and outsiders importing European vocabulary instead. To counteract this, however, one researcher has pointed to a finding of at least one Rhode Island gravestone with a partially legible inscription that included the phrase, "Consumption's vampire grasp." But then again, that line appears to be lifted from a published poem, which suggests a literary usage rather than proof that families routinely use the term. Locals would later resent the notion that their ancestors were merely backwards and foolish, rather than frightened and grieving, a perception that did not come with time and had been imprinted onto the town from the very day the ritual took place. In fact, the Providence Journal later ran a line sneering at the local population, claiming there were rural elements upon which the forces of education and civilization have made scarcely any impression. Decades later, an Exeter-based descendant named Everett Peck spoke publicly about how the Mercy Brown story had been treated, and about the way tourists had turned the grave into a spectacle. He reportedly said, He'd never heard talk of vampires locally until interest surged again in the mid to late 20th century, and then media coverage attracted tourists who then held night vigils in a cemetery. That said, he added to the spectacle himself when he claimed that he saw a bright ball of light hovering near the grave in the 1960s, likely a corpse light. On top of this are also the folkloric tales that came out of this story afterwards too, with some beginning to claim that they had seen Mercy Brown walking in the fields at night, turning her into a local urban legend after all. Even the grave itself gained a modern mythic layer, with visitors reportedly chipping away at the headstone over time, taking pieces as souvenirs. In fact, in August 1996, Mercy Brown's gravestone was completely stolen and then returned about a week later. Whoever took it eventually brought it back, and why they did, we will never know. And it only adds to the ever-growing list of strange events around her remains. Mercy Brown is only one name in a much longer catalogue of New England cases tied to consumption folklore. In Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, and beyond, there are documented stories of families exhuming relatives, burning organs, and treating the ashes as a remedy for years. She stands as a symbol of these events. She exists historically as a victim of tuberculosis and posthumous desecration. But she now also exists within the world of folklore, somewhat ironically immortalized.
Urban Legends is researched, written and produced by Luke Morgie, co-edited by Sophie Teakle, music by Billy Jupp, with additional sounds from Storyblocks and Envato. If you liked what you heard and want to hear more, please like and review our show on your chosen podcast provider. This simple task is a big part of our show's continuation and growth. To access more chapters through our bonus material, early releases, ad-free content and more, become a patron by clicking the link in our show notes. To follow us on TikTok, Instagram or YouTube, simply search Urban Legends Folklore or visit lukemorgie.com/podcast. If you have more information or a correction on anything said, email us on luke@lukemorgie.com. We aim to ensure that all information provided is accurate and up to date, and this remains a top priority.